You're listening to Jay's analysis. Tonight we move to Book 8 of the Republic. If you recall, last week we were discussing Book 7, one of the most important books. And some of the themes that were in Book 7 will pass into Book 8. In fact, the Nietzschean elements that we saw in Book 7, right? Things that, even though Nietzsche was quite critical of Socrates and Plato, there will actually be some elements of Nietzsche that will harken back to truths that Plato talks about both in Book 7 and Book 8. And in 7, we saw that the sun, again, if we recall, Book 6 is the intelligible light of the noetic realm. The celestial luminaries sort of representing the forms in terms of how light enlightens the eyes in the same way the forms enlighten the mind. And Book 7, of course, was where we saw the allegory of the cave. We got an in-depth treatment of Plato's view of metaphysics and ontology and how the mind sees the bridge of mathematics, right, into the realm of the forms. Right? Mathematics forms this bridge by which we can pass from objects in our sense that have length, width, space, dimension, and so forth. And this gives us, we can, for example, turn all the way in a circle. That's 360 degrees. 360 degree circle, however, is not a real object. It's an ideal object, a conceptual object. And that's an example of a form. And that led to the allegory of the cave, by which we saw that both the metaphysical realm, the world itself of passing shadows and phantasms, as well as the socio-political realm, are both all encapsulated in this notion of the realm of the forms. Kinship with flux, change, and becoming is what results in men being blinded and trapped in the cave. They're not able to see the truths of things, precisely because of those attachments to lower passions, bodily passions, according to Plato. And it's freedom from those things that allows us to peer into the beyond, to be closer to the forms, so to speak. And we saw as well that in Plato, that's a dialectic. The realm of the forms is in dialectical tension with the realm of the here and the now. So something like 360 degrees is a perfect circle, right? And that perfection is something that sets it apart from the things of our realm, of our world. Perfection is not something that we experience in this world. However, there is some participation of the circles that we see in our existence in the form of circle. The dialectic, however, is not just a metaphysical tension, it's also a methodology for Plato. And that tension is the methodology that leads to the alenctic method of question and answer and debate. And that's what gets us ultimately to truth, Plato thinks. Ultimately, truth is derivative from a single source, and that would be the one, or the monad. And what was most important, I think, in Book 7, besides the allegory of the cave, was that true noesis, or noetic knowledge, comes from the one, the monad, and this is all based on Pythagoreanism. Now, Pythagoreanism will come up again in Book 8, as we see that the analogy of the 4 different types of people in Book 7 will pass into Book 8, and we'll get examples of these 4 different persons. The description of the Calipulus, right, of the man whose character that resembles the philosopher king, is the highest ideal form of government. Socrates then will return to the argument that was interrupted back in Book 5, and he will describe these 4 individual characters and types of constitutions, both of cities and of persons, that will be exemplars of the kind of city that we're talking about, and then the stages of degeneration into ultimate chaos and anarchy. So these are 4 stages in the increasing corruption and decline of the ideal state. So perhaps at one time there was an ideal state. The appeal is then made to mathematics and geometry, since those things are ideal, eternal, and unchanging. The state itself should be mathematical and geometrical in number. And he'll actually come up with, I don't know where he derives this, but the number of man. There's an actual algorithm of sorts by which he figures the number of man, which is the perfect number. And this, of course, is a microcosm of the macrocosm. You expand that out. And this ultimately is a seed, a germinating seed, man himself, of the universe as a whole, conceived of as a giant circle or sphere. The Callipolis declines, however, as a result of moving away from these perfected ideals. And then we have these stages of decay that are embodied in these 4 different types of person. Now, the problem then arises that how will you ever set up the Republic as a serious philosophical question, given that there will be this decline due to the philosopher kings coming to rely on sense perception in order to put their eugenics policy into practice. And this is in 546 B and C. So here we have again the notion of the technocratic state already in Plato. How do I know that? Well, the technocracy, of course, is based on, as René Guénon would say, quantification. Quantification being the idea that everything could be encapsulated in some sort of numerical algorithm, or that you could tabulate, the proper number of citizens in a city, keeping everything in so-called balance, right? But just because we can tabulate things mathematically or geometrically doesn't mean that everything in the human realm operates in that exact same isomorphic fashion. It's not that like we can just translate into the human realm everything that we know in mathematics, because humans are beyond merely the mathematical, I would say. But for Plato, we have the idea of geometry and mathematics and quantification forming the presupposition, the basis for what the ideal or perfect state would be. And it pretty well is, I would say it's described pretty well in numerological and esoteric terms. There's no question about that. And we're even going to see that it relates to the other dialogue, the cosmology of Plato, the Timaeus, which is based on Solon's account of the secrets of Egypt. Now, for the reason I mentioned earlier that Book 8 will be similar to Nietzsche, is that the first type of government that is a move away from the Republic is described as the timocracy. And what is a timocracy? Well, a timocracy is the idea of those from the Homeric tradition. It's those who are spirited, we're told, in their souls, and so they desire honor, victory, and good reputation. And it's within the timocracy that the Homeric tradition passes away, and what arises out of that is the oligarchy. And even in Plato, the notion of the oligarchy, as we'll see, is based on the money power. This is when things really turn degenerate, and then of course from oligarchy you get democracy, and democracy is purely based on the passions. And then from democracy it degenerates into anarchy. So you have this movement away from perfection, math, geometry, and order into disorder and chaos through these 4 stages, and different interlocutors of Socrates will be representative of these 4 stages. And we see again that the individual, the microcosm, is a representative of the macrocosm of the city as a whole. And we're reminded, Glaucon is reminded at the beginning, that wives and good government and children are held in common in the ideal republic. So it is a communal, communistic order for the guardian class in the republic, despite the commentator who messaged me this week to tell me that that wasn't true. It most certainly is. Now, so as we said, timocracy, right? And this is rule by sort of a warrior aristocracy, I guess we could say. And this is kind of what you see in the Homeric tradition. So you see someone like Achilles, a war hero, being lifted up to be the leader and so forth, almost has a kind of demigod status. And the reason I mentioned Nietzsche is that it's similar to Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, where Nietzsche gives his thesis on where good and bad comes from. And in Nietzsche, it's whatever's good is the elite, the bourgeoisie, and whatever's bad is the vulgar and the common. And this, according to Nietzsche, is why we call things vulgar when they're distasteful because they were the characteristics of the common person, thus vulgar. So in Nietzsche's characterization, the origin of morals would be very similar to Plato's discussion of timocracy, right? And it's in timocracy that the warrior elite, the spirited elite, someone who should be in the guardian class in the ideal republic, takes his role as leader. And for Plato, that's out of order, because the guardian class should be subordinate to the philosopher king class in the ideal republic, and not the other way around. From the timocracy, things degenerate because he says these leaders, these warriors, after they've created peace, well, then they're going to want to make money and maintain peace. So they're going to want to be successful, and this is going to lead them to tell people what they want to hear. And that's when we get to oligarchy, because they're going to, whether they're going to want to be making money, I should say, and that's going to lead to the oligarchy, because for Plato, oligarchy is a front for the money power. It's really at this point that we start to turn towards making money and greed, and becoming wealthy is what becomes the new virtue when we start to pass out of the timocracy. These great warriors then become decadent and just want to be rich. And then they have sons, and the sons just want to be rich. And then we passed into an oligarchy, where we're no longer guided by rulers who have a sense of the just, a sense of honor, courage, and virtue. We're ruled by rulers who are concerned with the so-called virtue of making money. And what happens to oligarchy? Well, oligarchy then turns into democracy. Right? Oligarchy leads right to the chaos of democracy, and so the order is once again inverted. So we went from philosopher kings to guardians, and now we're to the masses supposedly ruling. But for Plato, oligarchy and democracy are really kind of interchangeable, right? They kind of lead to one another. They're kind of bosom buddies. They're pretty much the same thing, because all you have in a democracy is not real equality or the voice of the people or vox populi or whatever. What you actually have is a power behind the scene running things, but telling people in the mass what they want to hear. So there's an interesting discussion about the rule of money power in the oligarchy in sections 553 over to 555, and he says this is going to lead to internal civil war. And then up into 556, there's the discussion of usury. So when the money power takes over, usury comes in and takes over, and then you have a situation ripe for revolution. He says, first of all, then, aren't those free? Isn't the city full of freedom and free speech? Doesn't everyone have a license to do what he wants? It sounds like America, right? Freedom, liberty, libertarianism. That's what they claim, at any rate. And where the people have this freedom and license, it's clear that each of them will arrange his own life in whatever way pleases him. Yes, that is clear. Then I suppose what's most of all under this Constitution, that one finds peoples of all variety, of course. Well, then isn't this the finest and most beautiful of all the constitutions of the cities? No. Why not? Because oligarchy, right? These characteristics of democracy, he says, oligarchy leads to democracy. Then he too rules his spendthrift pleasures by force. The ones that aren't money makers are then called unnecessary. So if you're not producing, you're unnecessary. So democracy produces chaos. Why? Because it panders to the masses, right? And it becomes capitalistic, he says. It panders to the masses because, as we saw earlier in the Republic, like the sophists, those who adopt democracy have to tell the people what they want to hear so that they can remain in power. It's that simple. And so because the city in this constitution is a macrocosm of the microcosm of the individual, the passions are running loose in democracy, right? Democracy is based on the will of the people, but the will of the people is such that they don't know even what's best for them. So man battles against himself, and there's counter-revolution and civil war within the city, he says. Shame then arises in the soul, and there is disorder. Desires draw him back into the same bad company and into the intercourse and breed of a multitude of others. Seeing the citadel of a young man's soul empty of knowledge, of good living, of truth, they occupy that the passions then occupy the citadel of the soul. Now he goes on to say, having thus emptied and purged these forces from the soul, they possess an initiate. He's talking about those who fall from truth into democracy, anarchy, and chaos. They've possessed and they were initiated into the splendid mysteries and rites. He's talking about the city's Apollonian mysteries. They then proceed to return to insolence, anarchy, and extravagance, shamelessness from exile, and a blaze of torchlight. Calling insolence good breeding, anarchy freedom, and extravagance magnificence, and shamelessness courage. The end result is that after he spends a bunch of money, effort, and time on unnecessary pleasures, a great tumult arises within. So you have the collapse of things ultimately into anarchy as a result of the passions ruling, right? The passions rule in this inverted system, whereas otherwise it should be reason and the divine ruling. As we move down the totem pole or pyramid, if you will, of good government into bad government, rather than reason ruling the passions rule reason. And that's quite clearly what happens in so-called democracy. Democracy then leads, of course, to tyranny. So just like a man can be tyrannized by letting his passions run loose, drunkenness, whatever, right? These things can then become self-destructive. In the same way, to the city, when the mob runs loose, we have tyranny. He says, come now then, how does a tyrant come into being? It is clear that it evolves from democracy. Doesn't it evolve from democracy in much the same way that democracy does from oligarchy? The good that oligarchy puts before itself, right? Yes, it is insatiable in its insatiable desire for wealth and its neglect of other things for the sake of making money. It is destroyed, correct. Democracy's insatiable desire for what it defines as the good destroys itself. Well, what about freedom? Surely you'd hear that a democratic city has the finest of things, right? And they're the most free, and yet it falls into dictatorship because democracy breeds anarchy. Well, it breeds tyranny and then it breeds anarchy. So the freedom, quote unquote, that democracy is based around, the notion of everybody having this so-called freedom and license, actually is what leads to tyranny, because it allows the people to no longer be guided by reason, but to follow their passions. And then whoever is the best at selling them some line becomes their tyrant. So he says, I mean that a father accustoms himself to behave like a child and fear his sons, while the sons behave like the father. Everything is inverted and out of order. A resident or an alien is equal to a citizen. So interesting there, the notion of illegal immigration, citizenship. And isn't that what we see in America, the so-called American democracy, as it becomes the tyrannical oligarchy? And he even interestingly goes on to talk about animal worship. He says that once you fall into this state of oligarchy, tyranny, democracy, and anarchy, you're going to have animal worship. And not just animal worship, but dogs will become like dogs will be treated like men. We actually see that in America. I bitch about this quite frequently, actually. So extreme freedom can't be expected to lead to anything but a change in the state to extreme slavery, whether for the private individual or for a city. And this is one of the main reasons that I don't believe in democracy. I'm not a Democrat, because democracy presumes an equality that doesn't exist in reality. Not all men are suited to the same professions. Not all men are suited to the same operations and actions in life. And so to try to build a city around a false anthropology is self-destructive. And that's exactly what Plato's saying here. You've been listening to Jay's Analysis. The first half of this talk is free. If you like what you hear, go to jaysanalysis.com and subscribe at the PayPal link. There you'll get my weekly lectures that cover everything from ancient philosophy to medieval metaphysics and esoterics, as well as interviews. For $4.95 a month, you can bypass the state school brainwashing system at jaysanalysis.com.